One of the first things to do with the raw model is to rearrange objects in the designer and adjust the widths of entities so that you can see all the details. The wizard creates the entities with standard widths, which almost always truncates property and entity names. You should also move out of the main body of the model any entities that don't have associations with other entities, such as views, as well as position entities to clearly see the association multiplicities and keep the association lines uncrossed. If you spend a little time reorganizing things and making sure all the names are fully visible, you'll make the model much more usable and easier to understand. Okay, so let's take a look at doing a little bit of cleanup. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. First thing is that we can use this thumbnail view here to get kind of a high-level overview of the complete model. So you can see that it's not really overly compact. There are some lines that cross there and so forth. And I did move a couple of views out of the way, so those are the entities that don't have direct associations and so forth. But it's not very compact. It's not really very easy to use. Okay, so one of the things it can do is move this customer address object up here. It's just associated with the customer object. And so I'm going to place it right there and then move the customer object over a little bit. Okay, so already we can see that customer and customer addresses. Actually, I'll widen this a bit. Let's see, I don't think I can do it on that. Can't do it on that side. All right, so that now shows the entity name as well as the full property names. And I can move the customer over just a little bit more. Okay, so let's see. Now, sales order header and address. So the sales order header is related to customer, so we probably want that fairly close. Can probably move that up quite a bit here, because there is this association with the customer. And then we also have this address object that is used both with customer addresses as well as with the sales order header. So I'll widen this a little bit as well. A little bit more. Okay, and so now we can see all the names there. Okay, sales order detail should be fairly close to sales order header, so I'm just going to move this up a little bit tighter so I don't have to navigate around quite as far. And I'll widen that a bit. Not quite that far. Okay, that looks good. Okay, and then down here we have all of these product entities. So in this case, I'm going to select all of these and just kind of move them up as a group as a starting thing. So as you can see, there's several different product-related tables. So I've selected them all, and so now I can move them up as a group a little bit closer here. Okay, so here's product. I'll widen this a little bit so you can see all the names there. Here's the product category. Widen that a little bit on this side and a little bit on this side. In fact, I could move this down a little bit as well if I needed more room, but that works right there. Move it over a little bit. Okay, a little bit too far, because I still want to be able to see that multiplicity on each side of that association. Okay, and then come down here and we have the product model. All right, then we have some things that are related to the product model, so I'm going to select that and widen it a bit so we can see all the property names. Oh, can't quite see all the entity, so I'll widen that a bit, even more. Okay, and then here's product description, so we can widen that as well. Okay, so let's see, I'm not sure. Yeah, this is kind of a weird, so let me move this back up over here as far as I can anyway. And I'll move this over a little bit. Product description, that looks like fairly reasonable there. And I'll move the product over a little bit. Okay, so the only thing that's still a little screwy is that association there, so I'm going to move this over a little bit more, and this over a little bit, and up a bit. I just don't want things touching or overlapping, because that's just going to make it hard to find things and work with them. Okay, so there's the end result you can see. So much more compact, a little bit more navigable. Related entities are fairly close to each other. There's no crossed association lines. All right, so that's serviceable. Now, I am using this at a fairly low resolution. I would probably, if I were to use this on my regular desktop machine that has a pretty high resolution monitor and a fairly large monitor, I would probably do this a lot more horizontal so I could see pretty much all the model all at once. But this kind of shows what happens when you have a large complex model that overwhelms the amount of space that you have. So you can work with it, you can rearrange things. It's just that Entity Framework has some default ways it lays things out, which doesn't always work the most efficiently. Okay, but bottom line, how you organize things is very highly dependent upon your monitor resolution. And frankly, Entity Framework might be a really good, compelling argument for a bigger, larger monitor, whether you buy one for yourself or you need to convince somebody to buy one for you. All right, and as you work with the model, be sure to use these navigation controls. We looked at the thumbnail view here, but you can also zoom in and zoom out. So I can zoom out quite a ways to see the full model, zoom back in, so forth. And then I can also use this item right here to zoom it back to 100%. Okay, so that's 100% really is, you can get a little bit smaller, but you need to have the entities big enough so that you can see them and see the property names and so forth. Okay, then there are also a few tools in the right-click pop-up menu here that you can use to work with the model in the designer as well. Okay, add new, you can add a new object. Here's the diagram. If you do the layout diagram, it's going to put it back into a default layout. So I don't want to do that now because I just spent a fair amount of time organizing the entities so that they make sense, they work for how I work with it. But if you just end up making a complete mess of things, things are all over the place and things are crossed and some objects hide other objects and so forth, you can use layout diagram to get back to a decent starting point where at least you can see everything. It may not be the most workable or visually appealing view into the model, but it's at least workable. And then as you see, there's also options to export as image. You can also collapse all of the entities. If you really have a large model, you can collapse all the entities and then individually expand them like that. So I'll go back up into that item here, and now I'm going to expand them all so they're back into that state before they were collapsed. So that can be really handy. If I'm working with a complex model, but I'm really only working with a couple tables at the moment, I might collapse everything else, expand the couple that I'm working with, and that just makes it easier to look at things and see them and so forth. Okay, then also zoom. This has more options, so you can zoom in, zoom out. Those essentially make the same steps as these buttons here. And then you can zoom to fit to zoom the entire model so you can see the whole model. And then I can return to 100% right there. And then you can select custom zoom level or select one of these predefined zoom levels. You can turn a grid on and off. By default, snap to grid is enabled, which means as you move things around, they'll snap to the grid. But you can also show the grid. And now you can see the very fine dots that are probably about I don't know, as I'm looking on my monitor, probably about a little over 1/8 of an inch in distance apart. So you can actually see what you're snapping to. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn that back off. All right, then you can also display different property formats. By default, only the property names are displayed, but you can change that to display the type as well. And so now you can see the product ID is an int32. A lot of these are strings, some decimals. There's some date times in here and so forth. So that can be a really handy view in order to be able to see what data types they are. To keep things simple, I'm going to just display the name. Toggle that back off. Okay, then you can also select all. If I needed to move them all as a group, I can select that. Can do some validation. That does some basic checking on the validation of the designs and so forth. You can update the model from the database. If I forgot to add a table, I want to go back in and add stored procedures and import them. If I changed the schema of a table in the database, I can pick up those changes and update the model based on the changes in the database. I can also generate a database from model. So in this case, that's not really relevant because I reverse engineered this using database first. But If I were to create this model using model first and wanted to generate the database, I could do that from this option. All right, then you can also add a code generation item. I'm not going to talk about that here. And then there's some mapping details that you can look at. So this opens up a new window and select an entity there. Go back to mapping details, and that shows the mapping between the fields in the database for this table and the property names for this entity. So this is relevant because I can change this name. I could change it to maybe not city, maybe I want to call it whatever you might, another town, whatever might be relevant. But town would then still be mapped to city in the underlying table. What Entity Framework does when it builds the model initially is it just uses the field names from the table in the database. But you can change those. And here's where you keep track of all those mapping details. Okay, another option here is the model browser. And so this opens up a hierarchical view of the model as a whole. So you can do different diagrams, talk about that shortly. There's the AWLT model. This is my high-level model. You can look at the entity types and can drill down into the different properties. You can look at any complex types, enums, associations. These are all the relationships between the different tables, and those pick up the names from the database that you can change within the model. It'll remain mapped, or you'll have the same relationship between the entities. And then here's an entity container. That's a high-level object that gives you entree programmatically into this object. Okay, and then you can also take a look at the underlying objects for the store. This is referring to the data store, the database tables that these are mapped to. So this is a really nice view into the model that makes it a little bit easier to get to individual objects if you want to work with them. Okay, so that's the model. It's important to understand that the default context object that is used in later versions of Entity Framework, including Entity Framework 6, which is what I'm using here, is DB context. In older versions of Entity Framework, a model created with the Entity Framework Designer would generate a context that's derived from object context and entity classes that derive from entity object. But again, later versions now, by default, any new models created using the Entity Framework Designer will generate a derived DB context and POCO classes, plain old CLR objects, those kind of classes by default. You can revert to object context code generation if you need to. One of the great Model Designer features that was introduced in Entity Framework 5 was the ability to create subdiagrams, which are smaller diagrams that contain only a subset of the model. And I have to say, it's bloody well about time that Microsoft implemented this. I can't believe it took them this long to do it within the tooling. But anyway, it's here and it's great. So how this works is that you can have a diagram that has all of the objects, and then other diagrams, as many as you want, that show a subset of the model, such as a functional area that is way easier to work with. You just don't have as many entities cluttering up a single view into the model. But all of the entities and other objects remain part of the complete model. You still only have one model. And changes that are made to a single entity, no matter which diagram you make the changes in, will apply to all of the diagrams. So another way of describing this is that it lets you have several diagrams that visualize subsections of your overall model. By default, the Entity Data Model wizard creates a single diagram called Diagram 1, and that contains everything in the model. So there are a couple different ways of creating a new diagram. You can create a new diagram and drag entities from the model browser, or you can move entities from an existing diagram to a new one. All right, so I'm going to show you a few more things about working with this model, including subdiagrams. But first, I want to come over here to Solution Explorer. I'll collapse that. And here's the AWLT model. This is the actual designer file that contains the XML that implements this model, including information that's needed for the designer. So I'm going to take a look at this code file right here, awltmodel.context.cs. Actually, not that one, designer.cs. That's the one I wanted. Okay, so there's no code within this file. It's now in different code files. But this comment is important. It says T4 code generation is enabled for this model. To enable legacy code generation, change the value of the code generation strategy designer property to legacy object context. This property is available in the Properties window when the model is open in the designer. So that's the important part. But the comment continues on to say, if no context and entity classes have been generated, it may be because you've created an empty model, but have not yet chosen which version of Entity Framework to use. To generate a context class and entity classes for your model, open the model in the designer, right-click on the designer surface, and select Update Model from Database, Generate Database from Model, or Add Code Generation Item. Okay, so that second paragraph doesn't really apply here, but just be aware of it. If you end up with no context and entity classes, then you may have to do some additional work. Okay, so again, going back up to this first paragraph here. All right, so code generation strategy, designer property, set it to legacy object context. Okay, so let's do that. So I'll right-click and select properties, or I could have just gone to the properties window there. And notice that here is the code generation strategy. And if you look at the value here, if I can expand that, actually the description, it's used to set the code generation strategy of this model. The custom tool associated with this model, accessible from the properties on this item in the Solution Explorer, will read this property to decide how to generate code. But there's a problem. Notice that this is disabled. Okay, I can't change it. So if I select it and type things, nothing types. It's disabled. So basically, that comment in that code generation file that I just showed you lied to us. This is wrong for Entity Framework 6.x. T4 is the default. In order to implement this model using object context, you actually have to download different templates that Microsoft makes available. Okay, so just be aware of that. For the most part, using DB context as the object that your classes ultimately derive from using Entity Framework 6 is the way to go. It's a much cleaner, much simpler set of objects to use. You can use object context using Entity Framework 6, but you're going to have to go and find those templates, download them, install them, and regenerate the model. Okay, so I wanted you to be aware of that. All right, next thing I want to talk about is subdiagrams. All right, so there's a couple different ways, as I mentioned, of creating a new diagram. One way is to go here in Mapping Details. Oh, I'm sorry, not Mapping Details, in the Model Browser. Okay, and notice that you have this Diagrams node here. And there's a single diagram. It's called Diagram 1. That's the default diagram that the wizard created for us. So I can right-click on that and select Add New Diagram. All right, and so that immediately creates that diagram. And it says the Entity Data Model Designer lets you visualize and design your entity data model. You can create new entities in the model by dragging items from the toolbox. And you can add existing entities and relationships to this diagram by dragging them from the model browser. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is come over here to Model Browser, and I want to rename this. This is going to hold various objects that relate to the products within the model. So I'm going to call this Production Schema. Okay. All right, so now I have a diagram with a different name. Change the name up here, and that's now distinguished from, Diagram 1, Diagram 2, Diagram 3, just aren't very useful names. And now I can come in here to Entity Types and add a few product-related entities. There's Product, and I'll do Product Category, and Product Description. Okay, not the complete set of product tables. Notice that there's no relationship between the product and product category table here. But now I have a much simpler diagram that when I'm working with just these tables, it's much easier to navigate. In fact, I don't have to navigate at all except to select different objects. I don't have to do a lot of scrolling. I don't have to use the thumbnail view. I don't have to spend a lot of time just getting from place to place. So much simpler. All right, now if I decide that, in fact, I don't want this entity on this one, on this diagram, but I want it on a completely different diagram, then I can right-click on it and select Move to New Diagram. And what that does is it then creates yet another new diagram, here by default called Diagram 2. I'll just change the name to New Diagram. It can be anything meaningful that you want. And so that's the second way of creating a new diagram. Just right-clicking on an object, and it's now moved from that other production schema diagram. It's gone from here, and it's on the new diagram. Now, I can only do that once. If I come back over here and right-click on this and say Move to New Diagram, it's going to create another new diagram, which I may not want. So if I want now to add production category to this diagram here, what I'm probably the easiest way to do it is to just select it and click Delete. And, oops, nope, I don't want to do that. That's going to delete it from the model. Phew, I'm glad for the error message. I actually want to remove from the diagram. Okay, don't get a warning because this isn't a big deal. Now I can go over to this diagram, come back over to Model Browser, and select Product Category, and it's now on that new diagram. Okay, so the diagrams are great. There is some limitations, particularly moving things around. You have to do a little bit more work. It'd be nice if there was a selection of move it to different diagrams sort of thing, but you can move it to a new one, you can delete it from the model, which is what I first did, and I really didn't want to do that, or I can remove from the diagram. So it'd be nice if Microsoft added an additional option to move to another diagram, then prompt somehow to ask what diagram I want it to be on. But that's neither here nor there. Okay, so now I have multiple diagrams. If I come back over here to Model Browser, you can see that I have those different diagrams. And then over here in Solution Explorer, I have this single AWLT model EDMX diagram. So if I open up that, double-click on it, you can see the XML. It's a single diagram file that keeps track of these different diagrams, including which entity objects are in each diagram. So this is diagram, the first diagram, diagram 1. So this has all of the objects. I can remove entities from this diagram. There's nothing magic about diagram 1. It can change as I want. And then I can come down here and see that there's another couple diagrams, production schema and new diagram. So I just wanted to point this out, that this is where the information about what goes where, which diagrams are defined, as well as which entity objects are on each diagram. This is the file where that information is stored. Like other files generated and maintained by Visual Studio and Entity Framework, don't edit this directly. You can. You may be successful. You got to be real careful with how you do it, but you can do it if you want to. All right, so that's diagrams. So let me go back over to, I'm going to shut that down and go back over to my main diagram, diagram 1. Should still be open. There it is. Okay. Now, another nice feature of the Designer for organizing models is that you can use colors. And this is a relatively new feature, just in the last couple versions. All right, so I'm going to zoom this out a bit to see the whole model. Now, keep in mind, this is a relatively simple model. This is all of the tables, all of the views in the AdventureWorks LT database. You could easily have a much more complex view. Even the AdventureWorks, full AdventureWorks database can be far more complex. So the problem here is that, okay, I want to see the whole model. I'm not quite sure which entity that I'm interested in. So I need to zoom in or out, or I can go to the model browser, navigate directly to it, and so forth. But wouldn't it be great if I could visually change the appearance of one or more tables so that they stand out within the diagram? Well, I'm happy you asked, because you can. All right, so what you can do is color it. So I'm going to zoom back in, actually go to 100%, and I'm going to go here to my product table. And I'll go to the Properties window here, and notice that I have this Fill Color option. So let's say that I want to turn that red. So I can use custom properties here. I can just select red, and now notice product is red. So now when I zoom out, actually I'll right-click on this after Visual Studio finishes thinking, and I'm going to zoom to fit. And now that red table stands out. So make use of features like this within the Model Designer so that it makes it as easy as possible for you to find things that you need to work on and change things. And that is going to help you make a more useful model. Another customization of the model that you should consider doing is to set default values where they make sense. You can set default values for scalar properties in the entity data model using the Properties window. You can also set defaults in the database, but the entity data model wizard doesn't pick those up and apply them to the model. Overall, this is probably a good thing because you may not want to implement all database defaults within your model. So you have to set them manually if you want to use the defaults within your application. This is another area where it's probably worth some time setting default property values when they make sense, taking the time to do that, so that the application developer doesn't have to write code to set default values everywhere an entity is created. So again, it's a way to help the developer write good applications. Now you have complete flexibility in what default values you want to use in the model, whether the corresponding field in the database table has a default value or not. If the field has a default value set, but the model doesn't for a property, if you don't provide a value for the property when creating an entity, it'll be set in the database. If you set a default value for an entity property and the field doesn't have one, the value is going to be the model default, because that's what's going to get written, persisted back in that field when you insert a new row. Likewise, if both the field and property have a default value, the model value is going to prevail because that value is going to be inserted into the table when you save a new entity. Okay, so there's a little bit of convoluted logic going in there, so be aware of the differences. And you need to decide if you're going to set defaults in the database, in the model, or a combination of the two. The only situation to be careful of is when the field is non-nullable in the database. In that case, you have to provide a value for the property, even if the model has no default value. So this is a situation where you often will want to have a default value in the model. There are a number of places in this model where it makes sense to set default values because defaults are set for the corresponding fields in the database. So one is in the customer entity, and specifically the name style. If I go over here to Management Studio and open up the designer for customer, I can go to the name style field and scroll down here, and there's a description that says 0 equals the data in first name and last name are stored in Western style, first name, last name order. And click on the button there. 1 is equal to the Eastern style, which is last name, comma, first name order. Okay, so it's nice that Microsoft included some tips about the different fields within the database, and we can make use of that within the model. All right, so we have name style. So I want to set that to 0, which will put the name in first name and last name in the Western style. Okay, but what's weird here is that the field in the database is defined as a bit field. So you have to set the value to either true or false in the model. So I can come over here to Properties, and I have name style selected. There's the default value. I just need to type in false. Okay, and so that's now the default value for that field. If I create a new instance of the customer object and don't set the name style to anything, 0, in this case false, is going to be persisted to the table in the database. Another place where it makes sense, actually I'll pin this open, make it a little bit easier, is the sales order header. And there's a few fields here that would make sense for. The first is the revision number. I want to set the default value for this to 0. As you can see, it's a byte type, so I'll set it equal to 0. What happens with this field is that a trigger in the database will automatically update this each time you update an order. So it starts at 0, next revision will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. All right, another field to change is status. I want to set the default for this to 1. If you look in the description for this field in the database, it says that the order current status 1 is in process, 2 is approved, 3 is backordered, 4 is rejected, 5 is shipped, 6 is canceled. So apparently AdventureWorks has some sort of a process that they use for taking an order through these different steps. And so when you first create a new order, it's going to be in process. And so that's going to be the default. So I don't need to set that within my application every time. All right, another thing you can do is set the online order flag. And I'm going to set this to true. By the way, if I select the drop-down list there, it's unfortunately not real smart about figuring out what kind of data type it is, even though it's a Boolean. So it just doesn't give me options. So I have to type in true for that. So the database describes this one as 0 is equal to order placed by salesperson, 1 is equal to order placed online by customer. And this is a Boolean within the database. So the scenario here is that we're expecting by far and away most of our orders to come from our website online, so we'll set that as the default. Any applications that we have that allow, say, sales representatives to directly create orders using a separate application, we'd have to change that to false. Okay, a couple more here. I want to set the tax amount default to 0. We're going to assume that all sales are in Alaska that doesn't have any sales tax. And I'll also set the freight to 0. In this day and age, you can imagine a lot of scenarios where that would make sense. Okay, you might want to do something with the subtotal field here. This property of the sales order header has a default value set in the database of 0. But the value is computed by a trigger on the sales order detail table, so that anytime you insert a new order detail or change the order quantity, unit price, or unit price discount field, it recalculates the subtotal for the order. Okay, so for now, there's some things you can do with that, some customizations that you can do based on that. I'm not going to cover that now. For now, there really isn't any benefit to setting a default value in the model for this. Okay, another thing we can change is within sales order detail. So I'll come down here, scroll up, and set the unit price discount default value to 0. And 0.00 is fine as well. So that's all the default values I'm going to set at the moment. Unfortunately, you can't set dynamic default values for properties, only static values. This is a problem if you want to set a default value of now for a date-time property, for example, because there's no way here in the designer to set the value to system.datetime.now or any other variation of a dynamic date. You can set the default value to a specific date, such as 5/31/2020, if that makes sense, but no way to dynamically set it to today or 10 days from today or whatever. You can, though, set dynamic default values in code, and that's one of the ways that you might consider customizing entity data objects by adding code that sets a default value. Okay, but that's not the model designer, so I'm not going to cover that here. Okay, and this is also the same problem for the row GUID properties for entities that have them, because those store a GUID value that's generated within the database. So there are some limitations to using default values within the entity model designer.